The artist's bloody palette. Welcome back to Mindful Musings, where mysteries unfold like paintings revealing their secrets layer by layer. I'm your host William, and today we're stepping into a tale of art, deception and murder most intriguing. Through the discerning eyes of Miss Jane Marple, we shall examine how a work of art became a work of crime. Let's begin with the artist's bloody palette. Chapter 1. The Commission. The village of Mayfield occupied that peculiar space in the English countryside where tradition and modernity perpetually danced an awkward waltz. The stone church had dominated the high street for 4 centuries, yet now a newly renovated village hall stood beside it, its modern architecture a source of considerable debate among the residents. It was into this milieu that Sebastian Ashford arrived on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, his automobile packed with art supplies and ambitions. Miss Marple, tending to her roses in the front garden of her cottage, observed the sleek vehicle with interest as it passed. She had heard through Mrs. Hartwell at the post office that a distinguished artist from London had been commissioned to paint a mural on the village hall's largest interior wall. A substantial sum had been allocated from the civic fund, a decision that had prompted considerable discussion in the parish. Sebastian Ashford was everything a painter of his reputation should be. At 45, he possessed the kind of untamed silver hair and weathered features that suggested a life lived dramatically. His accent was impeccably refined, his manner alternately charming and imperious. He had spent the previous 2 decades building a formidable reputation as a portraitist and muralist, his work commanding serious prices from those wealthy enough to afford him. The village hall council had been quite fortunate to secure his services. There had been a considerable brouhaha over the subject matter. Some wished for a simple pastoral landscape, others advocated for something celebrating local history. It was ultimately decided that Ashford would have complete artistic freedom, which Miss Marple found to be either remarkably progressive or remarkably foolish, depending on one's perspective. Within a week, Ashford had established himself at the village hall, beginning preliminary sketches on the wall with charcoal. He worked with the door locked, allowing no observation of his progress. He took his meals at the King's Head pub, where he became a fixture, frequently holding forth about art and society to anyone who would listen and to several who would not. It was at the village flower show that Miss Marple first had an extended conversation with the artist. She was arranging her prize dahlias at the exhibition tent when Ashford approached, studying her flowers with genuine interest. "You have a remarkable eye," he said pleasantly. "These dahlias are quite extraordinary. The gradation of colour is almost painterly." Miss Marple smiled at the compliment. "I find flowers to be the best teachers of composition, Mr. Ashford. Nature has already solved all the difficult problems. One need only observe carefully." "Indeed," Ashford said, his interest seeming to deepen. "That is precisely what separates the merely competent artist from the truly exceptional. The capacity to observe without prejudgment. Tell me, you must know everyone in this village. Have you observed anything of particular interest about our community?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "Every village contains its secrets," she replied gently, "as does every human heart. But I've found that what appears scandalous on the surface often proves quite innocent upon closer examination, and vice versa." Ashford seemed momentarily intrigued by this cryptic observation, but then smiled enigmatically and excused himself. As Miss Marple watched him depart, she noted that he'd inquired about village secrets while offering none of his own. A curious omission, she thought, and filed the observation away in the vast catalogue of village minutiae she maintained in her mind. The following days brought an increasing frequency of telephone calls from various council members to the village hall. It seemed that Ashford had become erratic in his attendance, sometimes arriving before dawn and remaining for 18 hours at a stretch, other times failing to appear for days. His behaviour at the King's Head had grown more volatile. He had apparently become involved in several heated discussions regarding local figures, though the specifics remained delightfully vague. It was Mrs. Weatherby who first mentioned the connection to General Hartington, The general was one of Mayfield's most prominent residents, a decorated military man who had retired to the village some years ago with considerable expectations of respect and deference. His daughter, Eleanor, was known to the younger set as a rather unconventional young woman. She painted herself, dressed in a manner that caused considerable raising of eyebrows, and had been observed in Ashford's company on at least 3 occasions. Miss Marple attended the annual Harvest Festival tea held this year at the vicar's residence. The drawing room was filled with the usual assortment of village ladies, each with their own particular anxieties and observations. It was over the teacups that information flowed most freely. "That Ashford fellow has been seeing Eleanor Hartington," Mrs. Clement whispered to Miss Marple, her voice laden with significance. "The general is absolutely furious. His daughter deserves better than some bohemian artist. They say he's painted her, though naturally she refuses to show anyone the portrait. Shameful, really." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Young people are often drawn to those who seem to represent freedom," she observed, "though in my experience such attractions rarely survive prolonged acquaintance with reality." Several days later, as Miss Marple walked through the village on an errand, she observed General Hartington emerging from the pub with considerably more haste than seemed necessary. His face was darkly flushed, and he did not acknowledge her greeting. It occurred to her that whatever was transpiring in Mayfield was not yet complete. The mural was due to be unveiled at the autumn gala, now less than a fortnight away. The entire village was anticipating the revelation of Ashford's artistic vision. Miss Marple, possessed as she was with curiosity about human nature in all its manifestations, found herself wondering what image could have prompted such secrecy and such evident consternation. She was soon to discover, though not in the manner anyone anticipated. Chapter 2. The palette knife. The discovery was made on a grey Tuesday morning when the village hall caretaker, Mr. Pritchard, arrived to prepare for an afternoon wedding reception. The door to the great hall stood slightly ajar, which struck him as unusual. Ashford always kept it locked meticulously. As he stepped inside, the morning light filtering through the high windows illuminated a scene of considerable chaos. Sebastian Ashford lay slumped against the base of the wall upon which the mural was being painted. A palette knife, its flat steel blade darkened with dried paint, and something far more sinister protruded from between his shoulder blades. His hands were stained with paint and something darker. The ground around him was scattered with paint tubes, many of them squeezed and discarded. It was Constable Morris who first arrived at the scene, having been summoned by a considerably distressed Mr. Pritchard. The constable, though experienced in the minor dramas that occasionally punctuated village life, was visibly shaken by the tableau before him. He immediately telephoned Inspector Graves, the county official who handled more serious matters, and then set about securing the scene with the careful protocol of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. Miss Marple received word of the incident through her maid's nephew, who worked as a delivery boy for the local butcher, and heard the news whilst making his rounds. She was in her garden when the telephone call came from Mrs. Weatherby, who was apparently determined to ensure that Miss Marple was not deprived of this fascinating development. Inspector Graves was a tall man with penetrating grey eyes and the manner of someone accustomed to seeing through pretence. He had developed a considerable respect for Miss Marple's observations during their collaboration on previous matters. He greeted her with evident relief when she arrived at the village hall, having been requested to come by the local constable. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming on such short notice," he said by way of greeting. "I confess this presents several puzzles that I believe your particular insights might illuminate. The victim is Sebastian Ashford, the artist commissioned for the mural. He was killed sometime between closing the hall yesterday at approximately 5 in the afternoon and this morning's discovery at 8:30. Miss Marple approached the body with the careful observation she brought to all matters, her mild blue eyes missing nothing. She noted the scattered paint tubes, their contents mixing on the floor in a chaotic palette. The palette knife itself was distinctive, possessing a turned wooden handle carved with the initials SA. This disturbance of the materials suggests a search, she observed quietly. Someone was looking for something specific among his supplies. Cool. The tubes have been squeezed and discarded haphazardly, quite unlike what I would expect from an artist working in normal circumstances. Inspector, would you consider it possible that the murder was not the primary objective? The inspector's eyes narrowed with interest. You believe the killer was searching for something that Ashford possessed? That's a rather intriguing theory. Let us examine the scene more carefully. The mural itself remains unfinished, though it has progressed considerably. Would you observe anything remarkable about the work? Miss Marple studied the painting with increasing fascination. The composition was undoubtedly masterful, executed in Ashford's characteristic style with vigorous brushwork and complex layering. The focal point was a gathering of figures set in a landscape that appeared to be local, featuring recognisable architectural elements and landmarks from Mayfield itself. Yet there was something troubling about certain of the figures. One in particular, a man in military attire painted with unmistakable skill and exacting detail, bore such a striking resemblance to General Hartington as to be unmistakable. But the portrayal was not flattering. The general was depicted with features exaggerated in a manner that suggested mockery. His posture was hunched, his expression calculating. Behind him, barely visible but clearly intentional, were shapes that might have been documents or papers. The remaining figures were similarly identifiable as prominent village residents, though their likenesses were rendered with varying degrees of flattery. A merchant was depicted counting money with avaricious hunger. A clergyman was shown with a conspicuously false expression of piety. Each figure seemed laden with symbolic meaning. Surely this is remarkable, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. This is not merely a mural celebrating the village. It is a commentary, and not a particularly gentle one. The general appears to be the central figure of what I might call artistic critique. The paint around the general's portrayal has been partly scraped away, as if someone attempted to damage or obliterate it. Inspector Graves observed where she was pointing. The damage appears to have been inflicted recently, within perhaps the last few days. The exposed paint beneath is still somewhat tacky. This suggests that someone wished to erase or conceal this particular portion of the mural. A young constable approached, interrupting this examination. Inspector, we've been questioning Mr. Pritchard more thoroughly. He reports that Ashford had been increasingly agitated over the past week. There was an incident 4 days ago when the general came to the hall demanding to see the work in progress. Ashford refused, and there was considerable shouting. The general was heard to say that if Ashford did not remove himself and his poisonous brush from Mayfield, he would be made to regret it. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the inspector. Heated words, she observed, though hardly unusual when an artist's vision provokes strong reactions. Tell me, Inspector, who had keys to this hall? The mural room would surely have been kept secured? There were 4 keys, Graves replied, consulting his notebook. 1 possessed by Ashford himself, 1 by Mr. Pritchard the caretaker, 1 by the village council chairman, and 1 kept at the police station in case of emergency. All 4 are accounted for. The room was locked when discovered this morning, though the key was still in the lock on the interior side. The killer apparently secured it from inside. Miss Marple turned to examine the single window, which was positioned high on the wall and appeared inaccessible from the ground. The glass was intact and the frame was firmly sealed. One would require considerable climbing apparatus or assistance to escape via that route. The doors are the only viable exits, she concluded. As she continued her examination, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a series of paint splatter patterns on the wall opposite the mural. There was violence here, certainly, but also method. The palette knife had been selected deliberately. Why would one choose an artist's tool to commit murder, unless the killing itself was intended as a message? Unless the killer wished to implicate Ashford's own world in the crime, she inquired about Eleanor Hartington's whereabouts the previous evening. The young woman, it transpired, had been at home with her father at the time of the murder. The General confirmed that she had been present throughout the evening, though the constable reported that Eleanor appeared considerably distressed upon learning of Ashford's death. She had asked to see the mural immediately and had become quite agitated when refused. Over tea with Inspector Graves later that afternoon, Miss Marple shared her preliminary thoughts. The painting itself appears to be the central issue, she explained. The General's portrayal in particular seems designed to wound. But notice how the damage is concentrated on one specific area. The General may have come here intending to destroy the painting, not the painter. You're suggesting the murder was committed by someone else? During a confrontation that began as vandalism? It's possible, but the initial blow with the palette knife seems to have been inflicted from the rear, not during a face-to-face struggle. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Unless, she said thoughtfully, the initial wound was not the one that proved fatal, and unless there are more complexities to this situation than we have yet uncovered. That search through Ashford's materials troubles me greatly. What was the killer seeking? It must have been something quite small, able to be concealed among paint tubes. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting, her needles clicking rhythmically as her mind worked through the tangles and complications of the case. A murder had occurred, that much was certain. But the true pattern, the underlying structure that would render it all coherent, remained obscured. She suspected that the mural, incomplete as it was, held vital secrets, and somewhere among the scattered paint tubes and the violence of Ashford's death lay evidence of something far more significant than a crime of passion. Chapter 3. The General's Fury. The interrogation of General Hartington took place in the village hall's council room, a setting that seemed to heighten the General's natural indignation. He was a man accustomed to authority and deference, and the implied suggestion that he might be involved in criminal activity struck him as not merely insulting but fundamentally disordering of the proper arrangement of society. "I've already explained my movements," he announced loudly to Inspector Graves. "I was at home with my daughter. We dined together at 7, took brandy in the drawing room at 8, and retired to our respective rooms by 10. My reputation is beyond reproach. I have served this country with distinction for 30 years. I will not be subjected to this manner of interrogation." Nevertheless, the General admitted, with visible reluctance, that he had indeed visited the village hall 4 days previously and had demanded to see the mural in progress. Ashford had refused, and the General had expressed his displeasure in forceful terms. The man was painting lies. "No, sire," the General declared, deliberately distorting and caricaturing decent people for the amusement of those who enjoy seeing their betters mocked. If I have the right to prevent such defamation, I exercised it, but prevention through legal channels, not through murder. It was Miss Marple who proposed a different interpretation of the General's behaviour. She visited Eleanor Hartington 2 days after the discovery of Ashford's body, ostensibly to pay condolences, but primarily out of a desire to observe the young woman more closely. Eleanor was pale but composed, her bohemian sensibilities notwithstanding. She received Miss Marple in the drawing-room with surprising grace, offering tea and speaking with evident sorrow about Ashford's death. He was a brilliant man, Eleanor said, her voice carrying genuine emotion, and a deeply troubled one. His art was his only means of expressing truths that convention demanded remain silent. He saw clearly, perhaps too clearly, the contradictions and deceits embedded in ordinary society. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Did he confide in you about the mural's content?" she asked gently. "About why he felt compelled to include such unflattering portrayals?" Eleanor hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision. "He said it was a map," she replied quietly. "His own kind of map, where the true nature of each person was indicated by their appearance and positioning. He claimed to have discovered something concerning my father, something significant enough to warrant artistic exposure. He became quite agitated about it. Sebastian believed that truth should not be concealed merely because it was uncomfortable." "And your father's reaction?" Miss Marple inquired. Eleanor's expression grew troubled. Father was furious when he learned that Sebastian had rendered him in such a manner. He went to confront him, demanded that the painting be destroyed. He even threatened legal action. But Sebastian was adamant. He said the painting would remain, that truth could not be silenced by threats or legal instruments. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Eleanor, I must ask you something quite directly. When your father went to the village hall 4 days ago, did he go alone?" Eleanor's face paled slightly. "No," she said after a moment. "I accompanied him. I was frightened about what might transpire between them. When we arrived, father ordered me to remain outside while he confronted Sebastian. I waited by the automobile for perhaps 10 minutes. When father emerged, he was very quiet, very controlled, but I could see that something had shifted in him. He had accepted, I think, that he could not stop the painting. This revelation shifted the inspector's perspective considerably. Upon further questioning, Eleanor admitted that there had been no subsequent visit by her father to the hall. The confrontation 4 days prior had been the only direct encounter since Ashford had begun the mural. It was Miss Marple who observed something subtle that others had overlooked. During her examination of the mural and the scene of the crime, she had noticed that the paint tubes scattered about were not all of the same brand or type. Several were considerably older than Ashford's current supplies, their manufacture dating to perhaps 10 or 15 years prior. She brought this observation to the inspector's attention. "These tubes," she explained, pointing with her knitting needle at several of the old containers, "predate Ashford's residence here by a considerable margin. He would scarcely have retained them after so long. Yet they have been present during the search, squeezed and discarded with the others." Inspector Graves examined them more closely. "You're suggesting that someone brought them here? That they were planted among Ashford's supplies? Or that Ashford himself had retained them for a reason that seemed important to him," Miss Marple replied. "Items are not generally kept unless they serve a purpose, either practical or sentimental. These tubes bear the manufacture marks of a London artistic supply shop, one that I believe ceased operations some years ago. The style of their packaging suggests they are considerably old." She asked the inspector to inquire into Ashford's history before arriving in Mayfield. What connections did he have to the village or its residents? Had he perhaps worked here previously, or passed through during some earlier period? The investigation revealed, to Inspector Graves's considerable surprise, that Ashford had indeed been in Mayfield some 12 years prior, engaged in preliminary work for a commercial project that had ultimately been abandoned. He had lodged at the King's Head for nearly 3 months, and had apparently developed an acquaintance with several village residents during that period, though the details of those associations were now lost to the time and faulty memory. One name that emerged, however, was that of a former village resident named Colonel Ashford, a military man of considerable standing who had commanded a significant position during the war. The colonel had been Eleanor's godfather and a close associate of General Hartington's. He died about 10 years ago, Mrs. Weatherby reported when asked about him. Quite suddenly, if I recall correctly. There was some business about papers or documents that went missing, though no one seemed to know precisely what. It was all very vague and was never properly discussed in polite society. The general seemed particularly affected by the loss. Miss Marple's mind began to formulate a pattern, one that extended far beyond the simple matter of artistic disagreement or romantic entanglement. The scattered paint tubes, the search through Ashford's supplies, the ancient history of the village and its residents, all of these began to coalesce into a more complex narrative. She requested that the inspector allow her to examine Ashford's personal effects, particularly any papers or correspondence. In a small ledger found in his room at the King's Head, she discovered a series of cryptic notations, references to colours and pigments that seemed to correlate with locations and dates. The entries were written in a coded manner, clearly designed to obscure their true meaning from casual observation. The final entries, written within the past few weeks, contained increasingly agitated annotations. There were references to verification and confirmation, to evidence that required corroboration, and to a final act of revelation through art, the last entry, written 3 days before his death. He contained simply the words, "The map will speak, and those who have kept their silence will finally be known." As Miss Marple sat that evening reviewing these notations, a profound realization began to dawn upon her. The mural was not merely an artistic statement, it was literally a map, one that contained encoded information accessible only to those who understood the cipher. The scattered paint tubes were not random implements but deliberate clues, perhaps hidden messages themselves. And somewhere, in the complex layering of pigment and colour that comprised the mural, lay evidence of something far more significant than simple village scandal. Chapter 4. The Colour of Deception. The technical examination of the mural painting proved to be a revelation requiring the expertise of several specialists. Inspector Graves, at Miss Marple's suggestion, brought in a forensic analyst from the city and an art historian from the university who had published extensively on the symbolism of colour in contemporary painting. The three of them, along with Miss Marple, spent several hours examining every detail of the work with magnifying glasses and specialised lighting equipment. The paint layers themselves were subjected to careful analysis, and patterns began to emerge that had not been visible to the naked eye. The colour sequences, the art historian noted, follow a mathematical progression. Each figure is surrounded by a specific palette of hues arranged in a particular order. If one were to extract the numbers associated with those colours, according to a standard artistic reference system, one would obtain a series of numerical sequences. Miss Marple observed quietly that numerical sequences could represent coordinates or dates or references to specific documents or locations. The general's figure, in particular, seemed to be surrounded by colour combinations that were distinctly unusual, almost as if deliberately chosen to encode specific information. The forensic analyst, meanwhile, had made a curious discovery regarding the paint itself. Several of the pigments employed in the mural were not standard modern paints, but rather historically significant formulations no longer in common use. One in particular was a specific type of cadmium red that had been manufactured in a particular way only during the years 1939 to 1945. Upon further investigation, this pigment was found to be the same type present in the old paint tubes discovered scattered around the crime scene. The significance of this discovery was not immediately apparent, but Miss Marple began to formulate a theory that encompassed the wartime references in Ashford's coded notations and the mysterious death of Colonel Ashford some 10 years prior. She requested from the inspector access to the village records, particularly those pertaining to wartime transactions and any archival materials related to military personnel stationed in or passing through the area during the conflict. What she discovered in the dusty records maintained by the village council was a reference to a delegation of military officers who had been stationed temporarily in Mayfield during 1943 and 1944. The delegation had been involved in procurement and supply chain management for the war effort, era positions of considerable responsibility and access to sensitive information. The list of officers included the name Colonel Edmund Ashford, who it transpired was Sebastian Ashford's father. The elder Ashford had been highly decorated and had worked in close association with several other officers, including a certain Major Robert Hartington, the general's younger brother who had been killed in action in 1944. Miss Marple brought this genius logical connection to Inspector Graves's attention. "You see," she explained, "there is a family connection of considerable significance. Sebastian Ashford's father served alongside General Hartington's brother during the war. Both the general and the colonel served in similar capacities, and both had access to sensitive wartime documentation." The inspector was uncertain how this historical information connected to Ashford's murder. Surely whatever occurred during the war has no bearing on a death occurring more than 2 decades later. Miss Marple's expression suggested otherwise. "People," she observed, "carry the weight of their past actions throughout their lives. Guilt, when concealed, becomes an increasingly heavy burden, and if significant wealth or position depends upon maintaining the concealment of those actions, the motivation to preserve silence becomes quite powerful indeed." She proposed that Ashford, possessing a knowledge of some wartime transgression, had deliberately engineered his commission to paint the mural as a means of exposing that transgression through artistic code. The general, either upon recognising himself in the painting and understanding the threat it represented, had become desperate enough to commit murder. Yet the physical evidence troubled the inspector. The general, whilst known for violent outbursts, did not seem the type of man to execute a calculated murder and engage in such an elaborate search of Ashford's materials. The killer, whoever they were, had possessed knowledge of what they sought and had been willing to destroy with methodical purpose. It was Miss Marple who proposed that the general might not be the actual murderer, despite having clear motivation. She suggested that he might, however, know who the murderer was, or at least suspect it. A conversation between Miss Marple and Eleanor Hartington revealed something the young woman had kept private until that moment. Eleanor admitted that her father had received a visitor on the evening of Ashford's death. A woman had come to the house at approximately 7 o'clock, arriving by automobile. Eleanor did not recognise her, but her father had seemed unsurprised by the visit, almost as if he had been expecting her. The two had spoken in the study for nearly an hour, their voices remaining low but their manner suggesting considerable emotional intensity. When the woman departed, Eleanor's father had seemed resolved, almost peaceful, in a manner she had not observed for many years. He had taken brandy and had seemed lighter in spirit despite the obvious gravity of their conversation. "Do you recall any detail about this woman?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Eleanor considered the question carefully. "She was perhaps my father's age," Eleanor said finally. Her hair was grey, and she was dressed very smartly, almost militarily, one might say. She had an air of authority about her, as if she was accustomed to command. I heard my father call her Margaret, though I do not know if that was her first name or surname. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. "Margaret? Did she offer any indication of how she and your father were acquainted?" "No," Eleanor replied, "but I had the distinct impression that they had not seen each other for a considerable time. There was a formality in their greeting that suggested a reunion of long-standing distance. The identification of this mysterious visitor became crucial to the investigation. It transpired, through police inquiries into military records, viz., that there had been a Colonel Margaret Whitmore stationed in Mayfield during the same period as Ashford's father and General Hartington. Whitmore had been a signals officer of considerable distinction and had worked in close association with the procurement delegation. More significantly, Colonel Whitmore had maintained a residence in a neighbouring county for the past several decades and had been listed in the census and local records. She was still living, a retired woman of advanced years who had not been encountered or questioned in the initial investigation. When Inspector Graves finally conducted an interview with Colonel Whitmore, the interview was conducted with remarkable civility and considerable tension. The Colonel was a formidable woman, possessed of the bearing and manner of someone accustomed to authority and precision. She admitted freely to having visited the General on the evening of Ashford's death. "I went to speak with him about a matter of mutual concern," she stated with measured composure. "A matter that had remained unresolved for many years. I had learned that an individual possessed knowledge of certain wartime activities that were not, shall we say, entirely within proper channels. I felt it important to consult with General Hartington regarding the potential consequences of that knowledge being made public." "Did you visit the village hall that evening?" the inspector asked directly. "I did not," Colonel Whitmore replied. "That business was concluded by the time of my arrival at General Hartington's residence. I was aware that Sebastian Ashford had been in Mayfield during my previous assignment there, that he had maintained connections to individuals involved in those wartime activities. I had become concerned some weeks ago when I learned that his father, Colonel Edmund Ashford, had kept certain materials, items that might have been located during the search through his effects after his death. I believed Sebastian may have possessed these materials, or knowledge of them." "And what precisely were these materials?" the inspector inquired. Colonel Whitmore's expression remained controlled, but her voice carried a note of consequence. A wartime ledger pertaining to supply allocations, she stated finally. One that reflected certain irregularities in procurement, certain diversions of materials and resources that were not entirely authorised. The ledger had been presumed lost or destroyed at the end of the war. If it were to surface, it would reflect poorly upon certain officers and possibly constitute evidence of criminal activity. As she spoke these words, Miss Marple comprehended the full scope of the mystery. The wartime ledger was what Ashford had been searching for through the paint tubes. It was what someone had sought through the frantic search of his materials, and it was almost certainly what Ashford had encoded within the mural itself, translating the written words and numbers into colour sequences and spatial positioning that only someone possessing the cipher could decipher. But who possessed the cipher? And who had killed Sebastian Ashford in that locked room, leaving only the scattered paint tubes and the palette knife as testimony to their deed? Chapter 5. The Broken Trust. The investigation now focused with considerable intensity on the precise nature of wartime procurement irregularities and the identities of those involved. Colonel Whitmore, whilst not forthcoming with details, made certain materials available to the inspector that documented the official inquiries conducted after the war's conclusion. The ledger in question had been kept by a supply officer named Captain James Whitmore, Colonel Margaret Whitmore's younger brother. He had maintained detailed records of material allocation, and certain of those records had reflected discrepancies between authorised allocations and actual distributions. The materials in question, primarily metals and chemicals essential for weapons manufacturing, had been consistently underreported in shipments, with the implication being that they had been diverted to other purposes. The investigation at the time had been cursory, conducted in the chaotic aftermath of war, when such minor irregularities were deemed insignificant compared to the broader imperatives of reconstruction. The matter had been closed with minimal consequences, and the ledger had been filed away in military archives, though it had subsequently gone missing during the organisational chaos that followed. It was Miss Marple who observed a peculiar contradiction in the available testimony. Both General Hartington and the late Colonel Edmund Ashford had been positioned to oversee the very supply chain in which the discrepancies had occurred, yet neither had been directly implicated in the wartime inquiry, though this suggested that the responsibility for the irregularities had been assigned to subordinate officers, individuals who lacked the authority to challenge accusations or deflect blame. Who, she inquired of the inspector, would have borne the consequences if the matter had been pursued more rigorously during the war? The military records indicated that responsibility would have fallen upon Captain James Whitmore and Lieutenant Marcus Thorne, a junior officer whose whereabouts after the war were uncertain. Both men had been peripheral to the official inquiry, but both had possessed the access and knowledge to participate in such diversions. The revelation that Margaret Whitmore's brother had potentially been implicated in wartime irregularities seemed to provide a clear motivation for Colonel Whitmore's interest in the matter. However, further investigation revealed a complication of considerable significance. Captain James Whitmore had been killed in action in December 1944, less than a year before the war's conclusion. He had been posthumously decorated for bravery and was considered a war hero by his family and community. Any public revelation of his involvement in supply irregularities would have constituted a desecration of his memory and a potential scandal affecting the entire Whitmore family. It was this realisation that prompted Miss Marple to request an interview with General Hartington, conducted this time with greater informality and understanding. She visited him at his home, ostensibly to discuss village matters, but primarily to probe the deepening mysteries that now encompassed wartime deceptions and modern murder. The general was initially guarded, but Miss Marple's approach, one of sympathetic understanding rather than accusatory intensity, gradually loosened his tongue. Over brandy in the study, he revealed matters that he'd carried silently for nearly 3 decades. The ledger, he explained, had documented not merely minor discrepancies but substantial diversions of material. actions undertaken with the knowledge and tacit approval of senior officers who recognised that certain supplies were being channelled to resistance operations in occupied Europe. The official channels for such support were cumbersome and politically fraught. Unofficial channels, managed by officers like his brother and Colonel Ashford, had proven far more efficient. Captain Whitmore, in particular, had been instrumental in ensuring that necessary materials reached partisan forces through carefully obscured supply routes. His death had been a genuine tragedy, and the subsequent disappearance of the ledger had been a mercy, for it would have exposed not merely a technical irregularity, but a deliberate policy of unauthorized support for resistance operations. The discovery by Sebastian Ashford of his father's copies of the ledger, along with detailed notes regarding the entire operation, had presented a profound ethical and practical problem for those who had participated in the wartime activities. The elder Ashford had maintained the materials as a record of what he believed to be noble deception undertaken in service of worthy objectives. But if those materials were to become public, soon, the complex web of implied complicity and official denial would unravel, potentially tarnishing the memory of men who had sacrificed greatly. And so, Miss Marple said softly, young Ashford was caught between conflicting loyalties. He possessed evidence that could exonerate a man accused of war profiteering and instead reveal his participation in noble deception. Yet he was also aware that revealing this evidence would create scandal and controversy that would disturb the peace of those he knew. The General nodded slowly. He came to me, he said, several months ago. He sought counsel regarding whether he should reveal what he had discovered. I told him that some truths cause more harm than good when exposed, that sometimes the greatest service one can render is to let the dead rest undisturbed. But Sebastian was an artist. Not a practical man. He could not accept that truth should remain concealed. When he began work on the mural, I knew he intended to embed the truth within his artistic vision. I attempted to dissuade him, but he was resolute. He believed that art could accomplish what politics and history could not, that a painted image could convey truth without the complications of direct accusation. Miss Marple rose from her chair, moving to the window. And who else knew of his intentions? She asked quietly. The General hesitated, then admitted that Colonel Whitmore had learned of the matter through her own investigation into why her brother's wartime activities remained subjects of speculation and rumour. She had contacted Ashford directly, attempting to convince him that exposure would serve no good purpose. And Eleanor? Miss Marple inquired. Eleanor knew that Sebastian was troubled about something concerning my family, the General replied. I did not reveal specifics, but she was perceptive enough to discern that there were historical complexities at play. She cared deeply for him, which made the situation all the more painful for her. Miss Marple returned to her seat. General, I must ask you directly. Did you murder Sebastian Ashford? The General met her gaze steadily. No, Miss Marple. Despite my desperation to prevent him from completing that mural, despite my fear of the consequences of his artistic revelation, I could not bring myself to take his life. I am a soldier. I have killed in service to my country, and I have carried that burden with as much grace as I could manage. But murder in cold blood, undertaken to preserve personal reputation? So, that was a line I could not cross. Miss Marple believed him. His admission of fear and moral struggle carried the ring of truth. Yet someone had murdered Ashford in that locked room. Someone who understood the significance of the mural in the encoded ledger. Someone who had searched methodically through his supplies, seeking the original documentation that Ashford had used as reference for his artistic cipher. Chapter 6. The Hidden Ledger. The discovery came through the most mundane of means. Inspector Graves, in his methodical processing of Ashford's effects, had examined every item in his room at the King's Head with careful attention. Among his belongings was a collection of sketchbooks and notebooks, materials that seemed ordinary enough upon cursory inspection. Yet one of these notebooks, its cover unmarked and its pages filled with what appeared to be artistic studies and colour notations, contained something far more significant. Embedded within the binding, visible only when the book was properly examined under magnification, were thin sheets of paper bearing the faded typewritten text of the original wartime ledger that had been missing for nearly 30 years. Ashford had not merely created artistic encodings of the ledger's contents, he had somehow obtained access to the ledger itself and had fragmented it, concealing portions within his artistic materials and embedding others in code within the mural itself. It was a deliberate strategy, one designed to ensure that no single individual could suppress all evidence of the wartime activities. The question that now consumed the investigation was how Ashford had obtained the original ledger fragments. A thorough examination of his previous residence and associations revealed that his father, Colonel Edmund Ashford, had retained copies of portions of the ledger, materials that had been located during the initial posthumous examination of his effects. These copies had subsequently been stored in a safety deposit box in London, one to which Sebastian alone held a key following his father's death some 15 years prior. But how had the original ledger itself come into Ashford's possession? The investigation eventually led to a woman named Dorothy Thorne, the widow of the aforementioned Lieutenant Marcus Thorne, who had disappeared from public record shortly after the war's conclusion. Mrs. And Thorne was discovered still living in a remote cottage in Wales, where she'd spent the intervening years in relative obscurity. When questioned by Inspector Graves, Mrs. Thorne revealed that her husband had been profoundly troubled by the wartime supply irregularities and by the fact that the ledger documenting them had been allowed to vanish. Marcus Thorne had believed that honesty and accountability were fundamental to the integrity of the military institution. He had kept copies of portions of the ledger, which he had eventually shared with Sebastian Ashford, in the hopes that eventually, when sufficient time had passed, the truth might be revealed without causing undue harm to the families involved. This revelation provided context for Ashford's actions. He had been entrusted with historical materials that he believed deserved exposure, and he had chosen the method of artistic expression as the means through which that exposure would be achieved. Yet someone had killed him to prevent this revelation. The question remained, who possessed sufficient knowledge of the entire situation and sufficient motivation to commit murder? The answer, Miss Marple came to realise with growing certainty, lay not with any of the obvious suspects, but with an individual whose connection to the matter had not yet been adequately examined. Eleanor Hartington, whilst devoted to Ashford, had also been burdened with awareness of her father's wartime complicity and the shame that public revelation would bring upon the family name. Miss Marple requested a final conversation with the young woman, conducted with unusual gravity and directness. Eleanor, she began without preamble, you possessed access to the village hall, you had knowledge of Ashford's intentions, and you understood better than anyone the consequences that revelation would entail for your father and for the Whitmore family. Did you kill Sebastian Ashford? Eleanor's response was not immediate. She sat in prolonged silence, her hands trembling slightly. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I did not intend to, she finally said. I went to the hall that evening to reason with him once more. I'd become convinced that I could convince him to abandon the project, that he could be made to understand the harm it would cause. But when I arrived, I found him already engaged in a conversation with Colonel Whitmore. They were arguing fiercely about the ledger and the consequences of its revelation. Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she continued. Colonel Whitmore was desperate to prevent the mural's completion. She spoke of her brother's memory, of the shame that would attach to the Whitmore family name. She offered him money, considerable amounts, to abandon the project. But Sebastian refused. He said that some truths were worth any price, that concealment of historical reality was a betrayal of truth itself. When Colonel Whitmore departed in frustration, I attempted once more to convince him. We argued, as we had argued so many times in previous weeks. I begged him to consider the consequences for my father, for the Whitmore family, for all those whose lives had been built upon the understanding that certain wartime actions would remain concealed. But Sebastian was adamant. He said he loved me, but not enough to compromise his artistic vision, and his commitment to historical truth. Miss Marple listened with perfect stillness as Eleanor continued her confession. "I became angry," Eleanor said. "Angrier than I have ever been. I said things that I immediately regretted. In my fury, I picked up his palette knife from the table where he had been working. I intended only to threaten him, to make him understand the depth of my desperation. But he laughed at me, called me a coward like all the others, unwilling to face difficult truth, and something within me simply broke." The blow had been struck from behind, Eleanor explained, as Ashford had turned away from her in contemptuous dismissal. She had not intended a fatal strike, but had been driven by rage and desperation. When he had fallen, bleeding profusely, Eleanor had panicked. She had searched through his materials, looking for the original ledger fragments that she knew he possessed, hoping that if she could eliminate the documentary evidence, the secret would remain protected. But the ledger fragments were scattered throughout his possessions, embedded in various materials and sketchbooks. In her desperate search, Eleanor had torn through everything, squeezing paint tubes, scattering supplies, destroying his work in a frantic attempt to secure evidence that might condemn her father and those she loved. Finally, she had realized the futility of her actions. Ashford was dead, and no amount of searching would undo that reality. She had secured the room behind her and had returned home, where her father, possessed of his own acute understanding of the situation, had deduced what must have transpired. Chapter 7. The Truth Revealed. The confession emerged not in the formal setting of an interrogation room, but in the quiet gentility of Miss Marple's sitting room, where Eleanor Hartington had come seeking not judgment, but understanding. Inspector Graves received the confession with visible distress. Eleanor was taken into custody with all the protocols of formal arrest, though her status as a young woman of respectable family background ensured that she was treated with careful consideration. The evidence supported her account. The forensic analysis confirmed that the fatal blow had been delivered with considerable force, but not with the precision that might be expected of a cold-blooded killer. It had been a blow struck in passion, in desperation. In the overwhelming emotional turmoil of a young woman confronted with consequences too terrible to contemplate. Yet the law, Miss Marple reflected with characteristic melancholy, makes no allowance for the quality of desperation or the significance of the stakes. Murder, committed in rage or in calculated cold blood, remained murder in the eyes of justice. The completion of the mural became a matter of considerable public concern. The painting, incomplete at the time of Ashford's death, represented both artistic tragedy and historical testimony. The decision was made following extensive consultation with authorities and families involved that the mural would be completed by a select team of artists working from Ashford's preparatory sketches and notes. However, the portions of the painting that specifically encoded the wartime ledger information were rendered in a manner that made the details inaccessible to casual observation. The mural stood as a testimony to Ashford's artistic vision and to the historical complexities it was intended to commemorate, but in a form that did not constitute a public historical accusation. The wartime ledger fragments that had been Ashford's obsession and Eleanor's desperation were eventually recovered in their entirety. They were examined by military historians and were determined to document a wartime operation that, while technically irregular in its procedures, had been fundamentally righteous in its purpose. The materials had been diverted to support legitimate resistance operations in occupied territories, and undertaken with the tacit knowledge and approval of senior military command, though never officially acknowledged. The revelation when it came was muted and carefully managed. Military historians published papers discussing the operation in academic journals, where it was noted that certain supply irregularities had actually served important objectives in supporting anti-Nazi resistance movements. The scandal that might have erupted was substantially mitigated by the understanding that the actions, however irregularly undertaken, had served the greater good. General Hartington's reputation, rather than being destroyed, underwent a subtle revision. He was eventually acknowledged by historians as having participated in covert support for European resistance movements, and as an acknowledgement that enhanced rather than diminished his standing as a patriotic officer. Colonel Margaret Whitmore's own role in the matter became more clearly understood. She had been protecting not merely personal family reputation, but the historical record itself, seeking to ensure that the memory of her brother's courage and sacrifice would not be obscured by technical irregularities in procedure. Chapter 8. The Weight of Silence. The trial of Eleanor Hartington was conducted with considerable discretion, given the sensitivities of the wartime history it inevitably invoked. The evidence was overwhelming, and Eleanor's own confession ensured that there could be no genuine defence against the charge of murder. Yet the trial also became a testimony to the complex moral situations in which ordinary people found themselves. The defence counsel presented evidence of Eleanor's psychological distress, her conflicted loyalty between her love for Sebastian Ashford and her devotion to her family, the crushing weight of knowledge regarding historical matters that she had been too young to influence but old enough to understand. The judge, in sentencing Eleanor to 15 years imprisonment with recommendation for eventual parole consideration, acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances that had led to the crime. He noted that Eleanor's actions had been undertaken not from personal malice or self-interest, but from a desperate, however misguided, attempt to protect those she loved from shame and public condemnation. Miss Marple attended the trial, sitting quietly in the public gallery, her mild blue eyes taking in every detail of the proceedings. She observed Eleanor's composed demeanour as she received her sentence, the young woman's apparent acceptance of the consequences of her actions. After the conclusion of the trial, Miss Marple received a letter from Eleanor, written from the prison in which she was to serve her sentence. The letter expressed profound remorse for her actions, acknowledgement of the wrong she had committed, and appreciation for Miss Marple's compassionate understanding throughout the investigation. Eleanor wrote of her understanding that Ashford had been right, that truth, however painful, was ultimately preferable to the concealment that had dominated her life. She wrote of the irony that by attempting to suppress the truth through violence, she had created far greater revelation and consequence than had Sebastian's artistic endeavour alone. The letter concluded with a request that Miss Marple convey her deepest apologies to Colonel Whitmore and to her father, recognising the pain she had caused to those she loved. Miss Marple, reading the letter on a cool autumn afternoon, reflected upon the nature of truth and concealment, upon the ways in which the past continually exerts pressure upon the present, reshaping events and relationships in patterns that seem inevitable only in retrospect. She considered General Hartington, who had been complicit in wartime deception, but had been motivated by noble purposes. She thought of Colonel Whitmore, protecting the memory of a brother who had died in service of those noble purposes. She contemplated Eleanor, whose love and loyalty had driven her to an act that had destroyed the very relationships she had attempted to preserve. The mural, when it was finally completed and unveiled, stood as a complex artistic achievement. Those who possessed knowledge of its encoded content could discern within its layers the historical narratives that Ashford had intended to convey. Those who viewed it without such knowledge could appreciate it simply as a sophisticated artwork celebrating the village and its residents. Chapter 9. The Artist's Legacy. 6 months after Eleanor's incarceration, the village of Mayfield organised a retrospective exhibition of Sebastian Ashford's work. The exhibition, held in the newly renovated village hall and featuring works loaned from galleries and private collections throughout England, attracted considerable critical attention. Art historians began to examine Ashford's entire body of work, discovering that the encoding of historical information and personal narrative into artistic form had been a consistent aspect of his methodology. Other paintings and murals examined with informed understanding revealed layer upon layer of meaning that had gone unrecognised by previous viewers. The exhibition included a selection of Ashford's preliminary sketches for the Mayfield mural, along with portions of his coded notebooks. These materials were displayed with careful contextual information, allowing viewers to understand the intellectual and historical frameworks within which the artist had been operating. Miss Marple attended the exhibition opening, moving slowly through the gallery, examining the works with her characteristic attention to detail. She paused for considerable time before a smaller painting, a portrait that she recognised immediately despite the decades that had passed since its creation. The portrait was of a young military officer, rendered with Ashford's characteristic skill and psychological insight. The officer's face possessed both strength and vulnerability, determination and doubt. The painting bore the date of 1943 and was titled simply Captain James Whitmore. It was a portrait executed with profound respect and dignity, created it seemed as a tribute to a man the artist had never met personally, but whose historical significance he'd come to understand through his research and investigation. Colonel Margaret Whitmore, attending the exhibition opening at Miss Marple's gentle invitation, stood before the portrait of her brother for a considerable time without speaking. When she finally turned away, there were tears in her eyes, though her expression remained composed. She approached Miss Marple with quiet dignity. "I am grateful," she said simply, "that he is remembered with such respect and understanding. That is perhaps the greatest gift one can receive, the recognition that one's sacrifices, whatever complications surrounded them, were undertaken from noble purpose." Miss Marple responded with characteristic gentleness. "I believe your brother would have appreciated the way his memory is now honoured, and I believe Sebastian Ashford would have been satisfied that his artistic endeavour has ultimately served truth rather than concealed it." General Hartington, attending the exhibition in company with family members, bore himself with the same composed dignity he had maintained throughout the trial and its aftermath. He did not linger before the mural or speak extensively about Ashford's work, but those who observed him carefully noted that he seemed at peace, having accepted that some truths once revealed cannot be reconciled, and that acceptance of such truth was perhaps the only path toward genuine integrity. The local press, in covering the exhibition and the artistic revival of interest in Ashford's work, made only passing reference to the murder that had originally brought his work to public attention. Eleanor Hartington's name was mentioned, but with careful discretion and with acknowledgement of the complex circumstances that had driven her actions. As Miss Marple reflected upon the entire affair in the months that followed, she came to understand it as a parable of the tension between truth and silence, between historical honesty and personal protection, between the demands of justice and the complexities of human motivation. Chapter 10. Patterns Completed. A year after the conviction of Eleanor Hartington, Miss Marple received an invitation to a private exhibition of work selected by General Hartington himself. The General, it seemed, had commissioned the completion of an artistic project that he believed would honour both Ashford's memory and provide appropriate context for understanding the historical complexities that had surrounded the artist's murder. The exhibition, displayed in the General's private gallery, featured not merely Ashford's works, but also historical documents, military records, murals, and carefully curated materials that told the story of the wartime procurement operations and the resistance movements they had supported. At the exhibition opening, attended by historians, military officials, and those few individuals who had been directly involved in the events of the preceding year, General Hartington addressed the assembled company with characteristic formality and genuine emotion. He spoke of the moral complexities inherent in wartime, of the necessity for irregular measures undertaken in service of righteous causes. He acknowledged the techniques of concealment that had been employed and the reasons such concealment had seemed necessary at the time. He spoke of the courage of men like Captain James Whitmore and Colonel Edmund Ashford, whose willingness to operate outside official channels had ultimately served humanity's struggle against tyranny. But he also addressed, with evident difficulty, the matter of Eleanor's conviction and imprisonment. He stated publicly that his daughter had acted from misguided motives, and that while he loved her dearly, he could not dispute that justice had been appropriately served. he announced that he was establishing a scholarship fund in Eleanor's name to be awarded to young artists whose work engaged with historical truth and contemporary social complexity. Miss Marple, observing this act of simultaneous acceptance of and rebellion against the consequences of the past, felt a deep sadness tinged with respect for the general's capacity to acknowledge complexity without retreating into self-justification. Later, in conversation with Inspector Graves, who had attended the exhibition at Miss Marple's invitation, they discussed the entire affair with the perspective that only time and distance could provide. "It is perhaps the most tragic case I have encountered," Miss Marple reflected. "Not because of the violence, though that was certainly tragic, but because of the ways in which past deceptions, undertaken for what seemed at the time to be noble purposes, inevitably created pressures and complications in the present. Sebastian Ashford died not from any action he undertook, but from the weight of historical truth that he sought to expose. Eleanor committed murder not from malice, but from desperation to protect those she loved." The inspector nodded slowly. "It seems to me," he observed, "that the true tragedy is that the truth, which Sebastian wished to reveal and Eleanor wished to conceal, was neither damning nor particularly scandalous. The supply diversions, examined in historical context, appear to have served genuinely worthy purposes. The revelation, rather than creating shame, has enhanced the reputations of those involved." "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "The concealment was therefore unnecessary. The violence was therefore unnecessary. Had the truth been revealed from the outset, had there been honest discussion of the wartime operations and their moral complexities, none of this tragedy would have occurred." She paused, her needles continuing their steady clicking as she contemplated the patterns she had unravelled and the new patterns the investigation had created. "The mural remains," she continued. "It stands as Ashford intended, a complex artwork containing multiple layers of meaning. For those who know how to read it, it tells the story of human complexity and moral ambiguity. For those who view it innocently, it is simply a beautiful and sophisticated artistic achievement. I suspect that is perhaps the truest form of art, one that operates on multiple levels simultaneously, accessible to understanding at whatever depth the viewer brings to it." The conversation drifted toward other matters, but Miss Marple remained thoughtful, her mind returning repeatedly to the patterns and structures of the case that had consumed so much of her attention. As she sat in her cottage in the weeks that followed, her knitting needles clicking with the rhythm that had become the soundtrack to her meditations on human nature, she recognized that the case of the artist's bloody palette had taught her once again the fundamental lesson that had guided her entire life of observation. Human nature, she reflected, operates according to patterns as complex and intricate as any knitted design. The initial threads may seem simple enough, but when pulled together, they create images of profound complexity. And sometimes, what appears at first to be a deliberate design meant to wound is actually an attempt, however misguided, to reveal beauty and truth that have been obscured. Eleanor Hartington eventually served 8 years of her sentence before being released on parole, with a strong recommendation from the prison authorities acknowledging her exemplary behaviour and her genuine rehabilitation. She pursued a career in art administration and historical preservation, dedicating her life to ensuring that artistic and historical truth were properly documented and maintained. Sebastian Ashford's mural remained in the village hall, a permanent testament to his artistic vision and his commitment to historical truth. The encoding within the painting has become the subject of academic study, with scholars continuing to discover new layers of meaning within its complex structure. Miss Marple, in her garden, continued to tend her flowers and to observe the small dramas of village life. She remained convinced, as she had always been, that the greatest mysteries were not those of locked rooms and hidden weapons, but those of the human heart where motives intertwined and passions drove ordinary people to extraordinary acts. And whenever she encountered a particularly complex knitting pattern, one that required close attention and careful management to avoid creating irreversible flaws, she found herself thinking of the case that had ended, not with the neat resolution that detective fiction suggested, but with the complicated, ambiguous conclusion that real life so often provided. The mural had been completed. The mystery had been solved. Eleanor had been convicted. The truth had been revealed. And yet, Miss Marple understood the true understanding of what had transpired and why would continue to evolve throughout her life, much like the endlessly complex patterns of the human experience itself.